Welcome back. Experts say the true 2006 figure was likely to be about 32.7 million people infected with HIV. But regardless of the accuracy of the latest figures, experts believe there's a growing need to reinvest in prevention as the rising number of people with HIV sees costs of treatment spiral. Yet because the vast majority of people who are infected with HIV don't know it, there's actually no way to know if the new WHO figures are any more reliable than the previous ones. Well, let's come back to our guests again. Joining us to discuss the latest figures are in Geneva, Yves Souterrain, coordinator of the Strategic Information Unit in the World Health Organization's HIV department. In Washington, D.C., Dr. Paul Zeitz, Executive Director of the Global AIDS Alliance. In Johannesburg, Dr. Warren Parker, who's the Executive Director of the Centre for AIDS Development Research and Evaluation. If I could come to you, Dr. Souterrain, what is the biggest chunk of money spent on? Is it prevention and education, or how does the money get spent?
Well, the money gets spent for prevention and for treatment in some proportion which are not very different. Prevention is a little bit needs a little bit more resource than treatment. Today, more than 2 million people living with HIV/AIDS are treated with antiretroviral treatment, which is a great progress since in the last 5 years. But it means that these people will continue to have to be treated during the life, and this represents only 28% of people in need. So treatment is an area for which resources we need to be dramatically increased. But for prevention, the same. If we want to reach the different target of preventions, and especially young people, but also the most at-risk population in the different countries, it means that the investment of prevention needs to be increased very, very significantly also.
Dr. Warren Parker, what do you think? Is prevention a key to this? Presumably it would be.
Well, it's pretty complex. One of the things we have to appreciate is prevention can also occur in terms of preventing infections of young infants. And there's certainly a great deal of resources that need to go into that methodology of HIV prevention, which involves treating mothers during birth and counseling them around appropriate infant feeding afterwards. So certainly a large amount of infant lives can be saved through that form of prevention. Over and above that, it's not really so much the extent of the resources focusing on prevention, but focusing on the things that are epidemiologically significant. And as I'd mentioned earlier, one needs to focus on one of the emerging issues in Southern Africa, which is concurrency of sexual partnerships.
So, and is that something that you think hasn't actually been addressed?
I certainly think that over time there's been some stagnation in terms of focusing on particular methodologies of HIV prevention, certainly an over-reliance on promoting condoms as a primary method of HIV prevention without looking at the importance of addressing having multiple partners over time and so forth. The situation is also exacerbated in South Africa by late marriage, so many people aren't married in their 20s and 30s, which exacerbates the situation.
Dr. Zeitz, what do you make of that theory that emphasis on things like condoms is not necessarily always the answer?
Well, as Warren said, I mean, it's a complex epidemic, and you have to deal with it in multiple ways. So it's in sub-Saharan Africa and most parts of the world, it's being spread through sexual transmission. So you have to implement programs to delay the onset of sexual debut. You have to reduce the number of sexual partners, and you have to, when you are having risky sexual behavior, you have to promote the use of condoms. So it's not, there's no panacea, there's no one-shot solution. You have to do multiple different things. As he says, it's complex, and we have to look at sexual patterns, sexual behavior, and when people have multiple partners that are non-regular, it can lead to high-risk behavior. And so fidelity and closed sexual networks, those kinds of patterns can reduce your risk. And so people need to know about their behaviors and how that it increases their risk or not.
Okay.
And in terms of the resources, if I could comment on that briefly, just to say that collectively UNAIDS and the WHO estimate that we need about $18 billion next year to mount a full global response. And right now, the international community is, and affected countries are only projected to be able to provide around 11 or 12 billion dollars. So we have about a $6 billion shortfall in order to implement a minimal response.
Okay.
And so I think we really need to have an international solidarity with the oil-rich nations joining the battle and working with African governments and working with other stakeholders to win the battle,
okay.
and that hasn't happened yet.
Okay, let me just stop you there. So just want to move on to the issue of treatment. Obviously, the astronomical cost of Western-made drugs has forced many developing countries to adopt their own AIDS treatment programs. For example, Kenya declared HIV/AIDS a national disaster, with more than 2 million Kenyans testing HIV positive out of a total population of 32.4 million. Kenya's response: Nairobi began importing cheap generic HIV/AIDS drugs at the fraction of the normal cost. It also set up a text message service allowing Kenyans to ask AIDS-related questions and receive an answer for free. The result: Kenya reduced the HIV/AIDS infection rate to 6% in 2005 from a high of 13% in 2001. Other countries have followed suit. Brazil, Yemen and Thailand are amongst other countries that have now deployed their own programmes in the fight against HIV/AIDS. If I could come back to you, Dr. Souterrain, on this issue of drugs. Some countries are bypassing the patents and in some cases sort of breaking the patent laws, but to make generic drugs. Is that, do you think, something that is acceptable given the scale of the epidemic?
Well, country can use all the opportunities that are provided by the World Trade Organization laws and procedures. So country have different countries have already tried to use these procedures, and WHO is supporting country who would like to use this process for getting access to treatment. WHO is here for making sure that country and people have access to the best possible treatment based on the recommendations that the organization is giving for treatment and for other interventions.
Dr. Parker, do you think there's any danger that because there's sort of more awareness of that there are better drugs out there, that the emphasis shifts to spending money on drugs and researching drugs rather than on preventing the disease?
I don't think so. I think it's well recognised that treatment, care, support and prevention are all part of a continuum around HIV and AIDS. So it's not really a question of one emphasis over the other. What we do know is that drugs are very expensive, and they're also very complex to deliver, requiring systems of delivery through clinical services throughout countries and so forth, which is not simple. South Africa is 1/6 of the total global count, and against the latest count of people living with HIV. So we certainly have a huge problem in terms of addressing treatment, but that hasn't negated the emphasis on prevention.
Okay, Dr. Zients, presumably the problem is that the people who need the drugs most, or the people who are in the areas which are poorest, have the least ability to buy the drugs. How do you address that kind of imbalance?
Well, I think that the most heavily affected countries don't have the full ability to pay for the drugs. Two things: we have to get the drugs prices reduced, and through a lot of collective efforts, the drugs that used to be $12,000 per person per year are now under $100 per person per year. And that's been through generic competition. And we strongly support that. And we've actually moved the US government that was requiring all branded drugs from Western companies. Now 91% of drugs purchased through the US program are done through generically manufactured products. And those are products produced in India and in Africa itself. So through our advocacy, we've changed US policy. But we still have to keep battling that and keep the prices low and ensure high quality drugs. I mean, I think we want the best cost, but we also want to make sure the drugs are high quality. And WHO does have an important pre-qualification program that certifies that drugs that are being used in all of these countries are of the highest quality. And then we need to continue funding programs like the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria, which uses the market to get the best price.
Okay.
And so we're hoping that through this international partnership and solidarity working together, we can actually solve these problems.
Dr. Parker, can I just bring you in briefly? We're coming to the end of the programme. Would you say that we're turning the corner on HIV and AIDS, or is it still effectively a negative story?
Certainly in some countries, HIV new infections are declining, and that's very promising. The epidemic varies in each country, so the success one has against prevention varies accordingly. One of the biggest challenges in southern Africa is the high proportion of people who are living with HIV already, which means that even relatively low-risk sexual behaviors are extremely high risk because the proportion of people with HIV in the country is high. And that poses major challenges for prevention, since one's requiring quite a much higher degree of consistency of behavior and far lower proportion of risky behaviors.
Just very briefly, Dr. Souterrain, because we have run out of time, do you think that is it more positive than when you first started working on this area?
Well, it's more positive in the sense that, for example, more people have access to treatment, but the fight is not behind us. You know, there is a lot to do, especially if you want that the commitment from country to universal access to treatment, prevention and care could be reached in the next few years.
Okay, I must stop you there, I'm afraid. Thank you all for joining us for this very interesting debate. And thank you for watching this edition of Inside Story. We do welcome your comments and suggestions. Email them to us, insidestory@aljazeera.net. Bye for now.